Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. We're featured on the Compliance Podcast Network, which has many other awesome compliance-centric podcasts for you to listen to on your commute or while working out. If you have any novel situations in which you listen to the podcast, Lisa and I would love to hear them. Write into us. I'm Mary Shirley, and today I'm pleased to have Cindy Morrison, Director of Post Holdings, Inc., as our guest. Cindy, welcome. Tell us about your background and how you ended up at Post.
Thank you, Mary. So I guess full disclosure, I am actually a paralegal, and I was working in-house in 2004 when they had amended the federal sentencing guidelines. And our general counsel had asked me to figure out what Section 8, the compliance program, what that meant, what we needed to do. Fortunately, at the time, I worked for a company, it was a food ingredient company that was a joint venture between DuPont and Bunge. And as you may know, DuPont is like a pioneer in the compliance industry. They were doing it long before it was required. And so I was able to borrow many of their good practices, and I also had really good leadership that allowed me to be creative. And so we built a really good recognizable program for the company at the time, which was Soleil. But all good things come to an end, and that joint venture was divested. And when DuPont bought out Bunge's interest, I actually went with Bunge. I'm based here in St. Louis, Missouri. And fortunately, Bunge North America is here in St. Louis. So I went to Bunge. I helped them with their program. And then I bounced back to the law firm industry for a short period of time. And as soon as I made that left-hand turn, I realized how much I missed the profession of compliance, the day-to-day responsibility of administering a compliance program. And so I was extremely fortunate that Post Holdings is based in St. Louis, and they were looking for someone to be their director of compliance. So that's how I wound up where I am today at Post. So it's the third multinational organization I've worked for. And I really love what I do, and quite honestly, I do attribute a lot of my success in this profession to the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics.
Absolutely. They've been huge for me as well, and not only a lot of our listeners, but certainly the other women that have been interviewed on the podcast as well. So thank you to the SCCE and the sister organization, the HCCA, for really helping with our knowledge, our networking, and building the industry and turning it into a field in and of itself. So Cindy, I'm really glad that you mentioned that you're a paralegal, because sometimes we hear feedback from some of our colleagues in compliance who don't have law degrees that there are not necessarily as many opportunities, that they can be more narrow for those without law degrees. From what I can see, this hasn't held you back at all. So what do you think has been the recipe for success for you?
Well, I would actually say part of it is luck. I really believe being in the right place at the right time, having worked in-house, and quite frankly, many attorneys, including general counsels at the time, really, I don't know that they fully understood what implementing a program and sustaining a program meant. And so part of it was luck. And then I believe the fact that I had such great leadership support with the first organization I worked for, that kind of gave me permission to go beyond what just looking at it from a legal compliance perspective. More and more now we hear about the importance of the impact this profession has on the culture of an organization. And early on, I worked for leadership that recognized the value the program was having on the, quite frankly, employee engagement. And, I also think that I really enjoy what I do, and that probably shows. because as you know, Mary, this is not an easy profession.
Mm-hmm.
It can be somewhat lonely. So I would say, I mean, my recipe for success has been a couple of things. Obviously being in the right place at the right time, an early introduction into an organization that would help me really learn this profession, because so many of us wind up, or in the early days, many of us came from other professions. So I was a paralegal. There are people out there with their law degrees. Internal auditors have wound up in this space, as well as HR professionals. And I think where sometimes the narrow opportunities, it's really more for a chief compliance officer role. I think there's still some mentality out there in the C-suite that their chief compliance officer has to be someone with a law degree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, not everyone thinks that way, and we see a lot of chief compliance officers with far more diverse backgrounds than law. And I think you're a great example of someone who's been super successful. And I know you pointed to luck. I think a lot of it has been on your own merit. You're very strong, Cindy. And for the listeners, one of the reasons I was really interested in having Cindy on the show is that she is just someone with a really lovely presence. And I have no doubt that this translates to how you are in the office. And an example of this is very recently, Cindy and I were attending a conference, and I was incredibly frazzled first thing in the morning. I had to take a conference call very early before heading into a session. It was the last one of the day, and I had a very tight schedule before getting to the airport. And I'm just someone who is a worrier, despite knowing that worrying doesn't actually help my situation. And by luck, I was placed at a breakfast table. I didn't even see Cindy. I was so stuck in my own mind. And she said, hey, Mary, and we started talking. And it was just amazing how there was a great deal of calm falling over me just by chatting with you, Cindy. And so those types of people are perfect to have in compliance roles, the steady hands that will get you through crisis situations, or just sort of frantic and frenzied situations like I had admittedly put myself in that very morning. So I think you're right as well, that there is a lot to be said for being in the right place at the right time, but also some people carefully position themselves to be in the right place at the right time. And I think there's a lot more to you than just luck. So thank you for being someone who was so good to me in a moment of panic.
Well, Mary, I make it a practice. So for example, I really like the proactive side of what we do, and that, training and empowering employees to understand what's expected of them. So I love when I'm out and I'm training, whether it is an hourly employee. So I'm still today, Post Holdings is, we're a holding company, but we own many food companies. And so we have a lot of hourly production employees, many with language barriers. And I love it when you see the light bulb go on in their face. But at the same time, when I'm doing what I call the reactive side of our profession and I'm investigating misconduct, I think you have to be empathetic to do this job well. And it's real easy to try to find the black and white in a very gray area when we're talking about legal compliance. But when we're talking about people who are our greatest asset, but they're also our greatest risk. And when I kind of shared that I love what I do, I'm very passionate about what I do, because in the same way that, for example, being in the food industry, we never want our food to harm anyone, obviously. And the same way, if our employees show up with 10 fingers and 10 toes, we want them to go home with 10 fingers and 10 toes.
Yep.
I find part of the role of corporate compliance is we spend more hours earning a living than we do living with the people we choose to be with. So when an employee goes home, no matter what level of employee they are, what their position is in the organization, I don't want them to have their mind on something that happened at work and they didn't feel like they could speak up or it wasn't being addressed. And so I want them to be mentally whole those few hours a day they're with their family. And I guess that's what I guess I was trying to be humble, but I really feel like that's part of the key to my success. I understand that it's legal compliance, but at the end of the day, it's the people who matter. And whether we're empowering them or, unfortunately, investigating something as objectionably as we can, even when I'm interviewing a subject, my role is to find the facts, not to rob them of their dignity. So I never rob someone of their dignity. I'm simply a fact finder.
Absolutely. And that's one of my principles as well for investigations, that they're not interrogations or inquisitions or, putting a flashlight in someone's eyes. They are nothing more and nothing less, or should be nothing more and nothing less than pure fact finding.
And there are bad actors out there, but there are also good people who just make really bad decisions.
That's right. I think that's absolutely right. And then there are times as well where we get investigations where there seems to be enough for us to look into them, but it transpires that it's really just some kind of a miscommunication or something small. And so when you harm the employee relationship by going in too hard and too fast with people without knowing the full story, and in fact it transpires that there isn't a substantiated allegation at the end of it, I think you only lose in that sense, and there's too much to risk, because as you pointed out, our employees are our greatest asset, and you said our greatest risk. But I'm a firm believer in that the better we treat our employees, not just the ones that we don't work with in compliance, but the ones that work with us too, the better our own lives are going to be. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. I don't think we've had that raised before. And speaking of you being humble, I think there is a very big difference in terms of people who are speaking out of arrogance and tooting their own horn. And I asked you about success. So you certainly don't come across as anything but humble. So thank you for sharing your story. And I'm hoping that it'll provide some tips that will inform the approach of other people who are following in your footsteps. And we have a lot of paralegals in compliance, and so it's really cool for someone to have someone who's exactly got the same background that they do and understand the opportunities that are available to them. What are some of the key compliance risks in your area? So you mentioned fingers and toes being in one place. What else?
Well, the interesting thing is in the food industry, I would say, I guess what would be specific to the food industry is if we would look at the Food Safety Modernization Act, obviously all the regulations from whether it's the FDA, the USDA, we own everything from companies that make protein shakes to sausage to potatoes to eggs. So lots of regulatory things. What I try to do, though, quite frankly, and we're very fortunate in that we have lots of professionals and all those that are subject matter experts in all of those areas, right? So we have food regulatory lawyers, we have obviously great EHS people, we have good food quality, food safety people, and what I try to do is stay focused on the corporate compliance piece, and then. If you think about it, so we're also a consumer packaged goods company, and obviously, if you look at the whole trade compliance, I would say that's probably one of our bigger risks, and then some of the countries in which we're doing business. So while the food industry is different than the oil and gas industry, the pharma industry, and all the various industries, I stay zeroed in on just basically, those effective elements. But for us, I don't know that they're different than many others, aside from the food safety and the regulatory, in that, we're worried about, or I wouldn't say worried, but we're focused on, the trade compliance, customs, where are we at a higher risk of, bribery, depending on the country. And that may seem somewhat remedial, but I know where my area that I'm like a subject matter expert, and it's really in what do we need to have an effective program? How do we properly implement it and continue to monitor it? I don't
Wonderful.
know if that's the answer. Yeah.
It does. And so what I'm wondering is, for those of us who come from other industries, in your view, there would be scope to move into a role in the food industry, as long as you were willing to learn and pick up the unique food safety aspects and get up to date with those?
Yeah, and although quite honestly, as I'm talking to you, like I would be nervous moving into the pharma industry or even the financial sector, because those regulations are so much different than in the food industry. But absolutely, I mean, I think too, what I see in the compliance profession is that there are some people who are really attracted to, let's just say the third-party risk area or the policies and procedures area. I kind of deem myself to be what I would call kind of a generalist, in that I'm focused on those elements and making sure we have people in place that are covering that, and that we're all talking to each other. That is so important. So I can't just say, like for example, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but we have a privacy officer. We have a chief privacy officer. He is fantastic. He and I talk, but I don't lay awake at night worried about GDPR, about the new CCPA, because I know he has it, and that we're just in step with each other. And same thing with, we have a different HIPAA privacy officer. I know we have someone who does that. And so, but I think the important thing is talking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's a really lovely segue into what I was going to ask you about next, which is communicating in the wider compliance industry. I have found my connections outside of my place of work to be, such a refuge, a sanctuary for being able to geek out about compliance, to understanding benchmarking and learning more about what other companies are doing, and establishing genuine bonds of friendship. So I understand that you've been heavily involved in setting up a compliance community in the St. Louis area and successfully holding meetings, which is something that Matt Kelly and I have been doing in the greater Boston area. And if there are any listeners wanting to join us, please let me know. And we have somewhat inconsistent results as to turnout from meeting to meeting. So we rotate the locations in which we hold our meetings. And it's interesting that the western suburbs actually pulls together more people than in the city. So I'm curious to know, how did you go about putting your group together with colleagues from other companies? And what do you think has been the key to your strong rates of participation?
So interestingly, I was introduced to an individual by Jay Rosen a number of years. Yes. So a number of years ago, and mind you, I think this last conference where I saw you was probably my 13th consecutive time of attending the Compliance and Ethics Institute. Anyway, I met with Jay a number of years ago, and he wanted to introduce me to someone who was a part of a compliance community in the Los Angeles area, and he was moving to a company here in St. Louis. And so we met, and we tried to loosely form what we now call the Compliance Association of St. Louis. It's called CASTLE. And I don't know that successful is the word, because, here's the challenge. Most of us are departments of one or are very few. And, we are in the business of putting out fires. And so, and at the time that we were doing this, it was during the economic downturn, and none of us had budgets. And so we would try to meet at a restaurant, or we would do like a happy hour. But we had a core group of individuals. And while St. Louis doesn't have a lot of headquarters, at the time Monsanto was still Monsanto before they became Bayer. But we had Monsanto and some big companies that were really interested, and we got together. Well, I'm trying to make this a much shorter story. What we now do is, so we just literally gathered last week, and we now just have 2 meetings a year. And my Post Holdings, we hosted it this time. So we had a round table for 90 minutes late in the afternoon, and then we had a social hour afterwards. And about 18 individuals came. And we already know that our next meeting is in March. And what we did, really what's going to make this successful is we've simplified it. And another compliance professional in St. Louis area from Enterprise told us about how a professional organization he belonged to was governed or organized. And basically, when we meet so the host in March is another organization. They'll host it. They'll send out a call asking for, any topics anyone wants to discuss. So we had a couple of topics, and we always end with what keeps you up at night. But the beautiful thing is we have networked, we've made these friendships, and it's not unusual for someone within this organization to send out an email and say, hey, can someone help me with how do you do metrics? Or, maybe a question about the employee speak up line and then we've created these relationships that sometimes, it might be a one-on-one that gets together for lunch, or we'll just say, let's have a happy hour. But what has cemented us is just saying on the third Thursday of October and the third Thursday of March, we will get together. And before we get up from the one session, someone volunteers to host the next one. And I will tell you that when I sent this a number of months ago, I said, listen, I want to reconvene Castle. I couldn't believe the interest. And really, 24 people were supposed to come, but 6 had fires. So there's a real interest in if you're trying to start this, find people. And if you don't even have that core group, figure out what your headquartered organizations are, reach out, find out who's the head of their compliance, even if you start with lunch with a few people. But there's so much value in this from a selfish perspective for myself, because, this can be a very lonely profession. No one wants to be on compliance's radar because no matter how hard we try to prove that we're not the policy police, people still view us that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed it's not always the case, but a lot of the time what I see is that compliance, when we are a group of more than one, compliance sits with compliance at the lunch table. And I think the person who I've seen, not fall into this best is a former colleague of mine, Karina Volmer, who's Chief Compliance Officer at PAE, a government contractor. And she was fantastic. She's a real extrovert. So I would basically hide behind her, waiting for her to make friends. And then I would, make friends off the back of that. And she would make friends with people from all throughout the business, and would spend lunch times together. We'd then cement those relationships to the point where we were able to socialize after work, then on weekends. And so I think what you're saying is true. There is a great deal of being alone, but we don't necessarily have to be alone in our own workplaces. And it does take courage to step out and let people see you as being a person that is actually fun or nice or otherwise rewarding to hang out with in the office. So in addition to that, taking our steps outside of work to build our compliance communities as well, to feel less isolated, is awesome. And I'm so glad that you've, through it sounds like experimentation and a little bit of time, found the formula for getting a good turnout and having nice attendance.
I have to say, it's been a wonderful experience. And if nothing else, I would say our network is growing. And if I could just rephrase something very quickly about the isolation piece, and it's not so much about the compliance professional sitting alone in their office, because I have built really good relationships. But, unfortunately, when it comes to trying to talk through situations in our day-to-day jobs, you can't talk about, there's so much we can't talk about with our coworkers. So having someone outside that you can talk to, that to me is what helps me sleep at night, because you can at least run something by someone who's not in your organization, and they totally understand what you're talking about.
I think that's right. And I didn't mean to put words in your mouth about the isolation piece. That's absolutely my own sort of thoughts and observations there. And I have no doubt that you are rather stellar at getting around the office and chatting with people. But I fully relate to the side of, there are some things that you'd love to, for lack of a better phrase, get off your chest in terms of being able to talk to people about things. And, we have some really heavy stuff go on as well. I can't imagine
Right.
what it must be like for HR. And so when we get to the, you know, the real serious or egregious stuff that is somehow wrenching at the heartstrings and not having colleagues at work to talk about, but at least on a very high level, being able to empathize with colleagues in compliance outside of our workplace, I find that quite valuable.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's a good sanity check for myself. And you mentioned HR, and I know, quite honestly, I have nothing but a lot of respect for HR professionals. However, there's usually multiple people in an HR department, and so they can, they can talk to each other. And when you get into, and it's funny because I did introduce myself to a new hire once, and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm Cindy Morrison," and she goes, "Oh, and what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm the director of compliance," and she said, "Yeah, I don't want to know you." So you
that's
still
so
do have
rude.
those. You do have those situations where people are like, "Yeah, I just don't want to be on your radar," and I'm like, "Well, why would you worry about that?" But anyway, I don't.
I hope you kept a closer eye on her just because she said that. You've been practicing compliance for some time in international corporations. What do you do to keep your knowledge up and ensure that you always continue learning?
Well, so again, I think it's, you have to be really proactive about it. There's so much out there. So, I think subscribing to the right, not just newsletters, and blogs. I have really good relationships with outside counsel as well as our in-house counsel. So basically in my head, I've identified different subject matter experts that are attorneys. And, I've built those relationships. So as things change, or, I'm constantly reading what's not only in the news, but I subscribe to as much as I can. And while it might seem like overkill, I mean, I think we're pretty good at, being able to work through things pretty quickly, and or read through things quick enough that we can determine that stuff that we need to read. I save a lot of that for airplane reading because I spend a lot of time on planes, and it's just perfect to stay up on changes that way. But as you know, huge legislative changes, they're everywhere out. You can't avoid them. For example, even when the DOJ issued their recent guidance, I don't know about you, but I was probably invited to 12 webinars within the first 2 weeks.
Yeah. And then you see the posts going out on LinkedIn. Every vendor, law firm will put out their own commentary on guidance.
I think what's tougher than staying up to date on changes is getting the right information. So generally, one of the things I will do is go right to the source. So the actual, for example, staying with the example of the DOJ guidance, going right to their document and reading that. And then, from there, looking at what, like you said, vendors and outside counsel are offering. But for the most part, I try to go right to the actual subject, so I know I'm not getting quote unquote fake news.
Well, yeah, and another thing that can be problematic is that people are sort of making a statement about something and then talking about, are you in a position to handle this? So that they're trying to sell their services within that message. And that's fairly unhelpful unless you actually are a warm lead looking for a consultancy service to help you on it. So I think that's a great suggestion of going right to the source and making your own analysis of it. And if you want commentary, there's a few good thought leaders out there. Tom Fox is one of my favorites. He taught me a lot about compliance before I even knew Tom. And nowadays, of course, our podcast sits on his network. So funny how life happens like that. But I like to choose sort of select people that I know aren't necessarily trying to sell me things. And I like their thought leadership. So that's a great way. Maybe I need to think more about, instead of going straight to Tom, as well, relying on my own thoughts and looking at what the Department of Justice has said as well.
I want to say though, like, for example, when you think, I feel like the conversation we're having today is a lot about people, whether it's our employees, whether it's the compliance professional, subject matter expert. But when you brought up Tom Fox's name, I'm very familiar with Tom as well. I think about it, and let me go back to even talking about the networking or the compliance community. This is about people who are very passionate about what they do, that are willing to share, right? So I think about Tom Fox and the knowledge that he has shared with so many people, and we could name many, many people who have so generously shared this knowledge. And I mean, I started in 2004, and I was that person with, a deer in the headlights, and I was like, what have I gotten myself into? And this is such a generous profession, and with people sharing, and the expectation of the DOJ and the SEC is that you are benchmarking and you are sharing best practices. And most other professions, that would be some type of a legal violation, but in our world, it's expected. And we're fortunate because the people who are willing to share their expertise are really knowledgeable.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, and I couldn't think of a better note to end our part one of a two-part series with Cindy on really positive thoughts there, and a lot of gratitude from the both of us about being in the compliance field. Well, thank you for being on the show for now, Cindy. We look forward to welcoming you back for part two. And dear listeners, please keep a lookout for Cindy's follow-up episode coming your way shortly.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.
You're welcome.
You have a boss who is new to corporate compliance. How do you work together to ensure that the relationship is healthy and productive when supervisor and employee come from different backgrounds, and your boss is learning some of the intricacies and nuances of the compliance world?
Well, I'm very fortunate because you're right. I like to say he inherited me last year. And so he took on the role of Chief Compliance Officer, but he's also, we're structured in a very interesting way in that, and by the way, we also talked in part one about sometimes the limitations if you don't have a law degree, and yet some of the best corporate compliance officers, chief compliance officers I've met have actually basically come up through operations. And so my boss, his background is really in food quality and food safety. He is the chief safety and compliance officer. And in the way that I spoke earlier about, we want you to go home with all your fingers and toes, and we never want our food to harm anyone. We now have this whole umbrella where we have all of our risk areas under in one group. But what's really interesting is the way Dan and I work together is there's a lot I can learn from Dan. He's an incredible leader. He knows the business. He knows the operations very well. He knows the people very well. And he will be the first to admit that he's new to corporate compliance, yet he's read the Compliance 101 manual. He's been through his second institute already. He is, I guess really what we're doing is we're playing off of each other's strengths and weaknesses. And so it's actually working out very well. As a matter of fact, he's more strategic and I'm more tactical. And yet under his tutelage, I will become, I know, a much better leader, a stronger leader. I think it's important to recognize your weaknesses, and I am a people person, but I prefer to be invited places, not invite myself. That's just not natural. And yet, if I wait for our businesses to invite me to come in and meet with their HR teams or train at their locations, that invitation's never going to come. And so he's teaching me the fine art of inviting myself. And he's also teaching me a lot about our operations. And at the same time, we spend a lot of time together talking through our risks and visiting our businesses together. And like I said, he's not taking the assumption that he knows food regulation, so he's just going to know corporate compliance. He's taken the time to really understand, what's expected of him in his role. At the same time, he trusts me and the knowledge and the experience I have. So I would say it's working out really well. I was nervous at first, but it's turned out very well in that I recognize what he can teach me, and he is open to learning from me as well as some of the great resources that are out there.
That's great. And just thinking for anyone on the podcast, I know for sure that we have listeners out there who aren't yet in the compliance world, and they're looking for ways to break into compliance. So it sounds like you may have recommended that he read a Compliance 101, which I think is an SCCE publication. He's attended a couple of the forums, the annual conference from the SCCE. Did you give him any suggestions for additional reading materials, for example, signing up to blogs or maybe podcasts, anything else that you thought would be accelerators to help his knowledge?
Oh, yeah, I kind of inundate the poor guy with links to articles and blogs. And I also just a few weeks ago gave him Roy Snell's book, The Accidental Compliance Professional. He read it overnight. And so then I gave him How to Become a Wildly Effective Compliance.
Yep, classic.
And so his thirst for knowledge is incredible, and he's a consummate reader. And he's also still very strongly thinking about like doing an academy or some other type of, compliance training, learning. And he's now a proud member of our Compliance Association of St. Louis. So that's the other thing I have tried to do. For example, I don't resent that, like, when our chief compliance officer left last year, that they appointed Dan. I don't resent that at all. I love the day-to-day. I love the tactical part of what I do. And I've made it a point of introducing Dan to other chief compliance officers in St. Louis so that he has that resource.
Yeah, that's great. And, they've already got you, Cindy. So if there are additional knowledge areas that he has and contribute to with his strengths whilst he's learning about compliance, I think that's fantastic, right? It seems like there's a really beautiful balance between, as you mentioned, you complementing each other. So you're covering each other's gaps and therefore making an excellent team.
Yes.
And there was one thing that I wanted to follow up on that you mentioned. So I've mentioned this multiple times on the podcast, but again, it's very true. I am an introvert through and through, and so the idea of inviting myself to business things, kind of inserting myself, if you will, it doesn't really come naturally to me. So how did your boss share with you, or how did he teach you more about being more effective at that?
Well, the expectation is that I'm doing a good job, and that I also know it's really important to build those relationships. And so I guess the short answer of that is I don't think it was an option. So his expectation was that I was visiting the corporate headquarters as well as our operation locations. So Post Holdings, as a holding company, we own 6 different business units. That's how we refer to them. And all those business units may own other companies. And so in my world, there are 7 CEOs, there are 7 HR departments, 7 executive leadership teams. And so communication is incredibly important. And if I'm just communicating through email or the phone, they don't know the person. And so I would like to still be sitting in my office waiting for an invitation, but basically his message was no. It was one of my objectives so we just finished a fiscal year, and one of my objectives was to get out, introduce myself to every CEO, do so much training a year. But he also helps make some of that happen. So for example, we attend our annual planning meeting where all of our leadership is there, and he opens doors as well as he expects me to open some doors myself. So basically, I just had to swallow my fear, pick up the phone, and say I was coming.
Well, that's great. And what I'm hearing or assuming from this is that he also makes sure that you have the resources, and in this case, i.e. the budget, to be able to get out there and do some palm pressing and get on the ground. Would that be fair to assume?
Absolutely, it's fair to assume. I get the resources from him. The other thing I think that's very important to mention is this is not an easy profession to be in if you don't have an advocate. And while Dan might have been new to corporate compliance, this specific area, I, for a moment, would never doubt that Dan has my back. Not obviously if I go rogue, but I have his full support. And we also have our leadership's full support. So I can pick up the phone and talk to our CEO just like Dan can. It's never, I don't have to communicate through Dan. The expectation is that I'm communicating as well as Dan is communicating.
Yeah, he sounds amazing.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Will you tell us about a book that has changed the way you see things in the office and subsequently model your behavior, and how it has positively impacted on your professional and personal life?
Oh, how long do we have? Just kidding.
We have time. We have time. Go for it.
So so the book that has had the most impact on me is The Four Agreements. It's by I'm Don Miguel Ruiz, R-U-I-Z. What's interesting about this is, in passing, and again, in no way am I associated with the Society of Corporate Compliance and Education, other than the fact that I'm a member and I'm certified. However, I was having a conversation in passing with Greg Traguba at one of the annual institutes, and in one of the first years I went, Greg was a presenter. And this is a few years after the fact, and I happened to run into him, and I was telling him how much I enjoyed it. And I was able to be very specific about what he did during that presentation. And so anyway, somehow in the course of our conversation, he suggested that I read The Four Agreements. And I did. And I will tell you, it has profoundly impacted me personally and professionally. And I actually wear a bracelet that has the Four Agreements on it. And they are... The first is be impeccable with your word. And so it's easy to think that's about, being truthful, but it's also about not gossiping. And if I think about our role as compliance professionals, again, I don't ever want to rob anyone of their dignity or someone's respect. So I take the confidentiality that's required of us very seriously. And also, I think our words can be as large of a weapon as some of the most destructive weapons we have. We see that with our employees. It's potential in each of us as individuals. So that was easy. But the thing about the Four Agreements is, and I'm going to try to wrap this into like when we're out and we're training employees, or we're talking about corporate compliance. Think about, here's my example. I have 4 siblings. There are 5 of us. I'm the middle child, and same house, same parents, same rules. How did we all turn out differently? Well, while we're receiving the same information, we're processing it based on our disposition, and each of us are born with a certain disposition. So you think about your employees. You have hundreds of them in some locations, walking into the door. And suddenly we expect them all to behave the same. And yet we're bringing stuff in, messages that we've received throughout our life. And everyone has burdens, they have things on their mind, and they're bringing that into the door. So the purpose of the Four Agreements is it talks about things that we've learned throughout our lives. And it's trying to change some of that. So the first agreement you make with yourself is to be impeccable with your word. The second is don't make assumptions.
Big one.
So when we think about our employees and we think about how they interact with each other, so often it's because we've made assumptions. Or even think about when you were a child on the playground and Mary doesn't like me because she doesn't invite me to play whatever. Well, it could just be that Mary is an incredible introvert, or it could be that, Mary doesn't even realize I'm there. And so my point is, it's like, I try not to make assumptions. That is one thing, if you can change, right? And when we think about compliance programs, and with all due respect to all the enforcement agencies that say we have to have all these things, if the one thing that is missing, if there's no dialogue in your organization, right? So if your C-suite is making assumptions about something in the middle level, or the lower level is making assumptions, it creates a very dangerous environment. So I try never to make assumptions. The other one is the other agreement is don't take anything personal. So in the same way that we may say something negative to someone, even if I say something positive like, "Oh, I really like your coat," it simply means I like your coat. It shouldn't matter what I think. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about the imposter thing, right? If we know we're doing the right thing, if we're taking the next right step and we're not intentionally trying to hurt someone, it's good, right? So don't take anything personal. And the last agreement, and the last agreement is always do your best. But the most important thing to remember with that is my best today will look different than my best tomorrow. And it's definitely different than it was yesterday. So I know it's interesting, but I will tell you it was so profound that I actually, there's like a workbook that goes along with it, or it's like a partner book, and it's a shorter version. And I often look at that because I feel like if I can at least half the time get some of those 4 agreements right, I'm going to have a better day. I'll be a better professional. I'll be a better person. So it was probably the most impactful book I've ever read.
That's wonderful. And Cindy, you're so influential to me. I have such a great deal of respect for you that I instantly bought that book after you recommended it to me, and I read it fairly soon thereafter. I think I was like you. Flight's a fantastic time for looking through readings. I otherwise see them as dead time unless there's something showing on the movies that I really want to watch. So I make so much use out of my flight time, including that point at which, you've boarded, but the plane's not ready to go and the entertainment system's not on. I just do so much texting and leaving voice messages in that time, and I'm super productive. But I got a great deal from the book, and what struck me is that all of the agreements are very simple, right? Like the message or the value is very simple, but some of them are really difficult. We've always been conditioned our whole lives to be gossipy. It's almost a survival thing, right? Like if you say something negative about someone else, that protects you in that moment. It can be hard to do your best when you're not feeling motivated. All of them were, very easy for me to understand what I had to do, but not so easy, I think, to implement. So I think that's the challenge for me going forward, is taking what I learned and ensuring that I'm living those values going forward. Did it take some time for you to adjust?
Oh, yes. I mean, and please, I don't do it perfectly by any means. However, it's really interesting because as I read that book, I've never taken so many notes, and the way I memorize things is by writing them down and writing them again. And I just wrote in so much, and I still will go back and write. And again, you said, and I agree with you, it's hard to keep them in practice. But when you mentioned, it's hard to do your best when you're not motivated. Well, that may be the best you can do that day. So think about, we're so good at beating ourselves up. And I'm a perfectionist, right? So another book I read was The Gift of Imperfection by Brene Brown. And it's another one that I just swallowed up. And I feel like if a book is speaking to you that much, there's something there for me, at least, that I need to look at. And I believe I really want to know myself, because for whatever reason, it's so important to me to be my authentic self. I just want to be an authentic person. And that means that I am imperfect, and by no means, am I perfect and do I have these 4 agreements down all the time. But I will tell you that when I start getting uncomfortable about something, simply saying, did you take that personal? Or wait a minute, did you make an assumption? And that's the difference. Or if I do find myself gossiping, is it when I'm doing that, then I'm taking the focus off myself, and I need to come right back to Cindy Morrison, and what does Cindy Morrison need to work on?
Great one. Yeah.
So like I said, if you can get it right 50% of the time, but I will tell you that book really, I mean, anytime I talk about it, I want to go grab it.
Well, I shall let you get back to it shortly. So thank you so much for your time in doing this little series with us, Cindy. It is such a pleasure to have you on the show, but also to know you. Thank you for being there for me.
Thank you, Mary. It's just so easy to talk to you, and I'm just so grateful that our professions have connected us.
Absolutely. So to wrap up today's show, everyone, I wanted to touch a little more on imposter syndrome for a moment. A lot of the readings that are available on the intranet are often to do with what are the things that you can do to help combat your own imposter syndrome. But I want to set you a small challenge, hopefully a very tiny wick movement that will have some positive ripples. So often in life, we see fantastic people who are outperforming day to day. They constantly do a good job, or they've done a project and pulled it off, and you think, well, that was such a feat. I'm sure they know that. But the reality is we just never know what people are thinking on the inside. So I'm going to ask you to identify someone in your lives for the next 7 days. And I know you might not be at work for 7 days in a row, but you're going to be interacting with people during your weekend who are doing their job. And I want you to take a moment to tell them about something that you really admire about how they do their job, an accomplishment that you think is awesome and needs to be brought to their attention, something that lifts someone up and makes them feel really good about themselves. So hopefully together we can impact the lives of people who may be struggling and going through a little bit of imposter syndrome now, because we know that it's hugely prolific and people sit there suffering silently from it. So if you'll do me that favor, I'd be most grateful. Thank you so much for listening.